August 2026, only a few weeks ago, Jason Arde, a Cambridge Professor of Sociology Education, discovered dead in his home. I don't know if you've been following the story, but as someone who's spent over 10 years in universities, it caught my attention. Arde had been a professor at Cambridge, celebrated as the youngest black professor ever appointed to that role. On appointment, the Vice Chancellor had declared that Arde is an exceptional scholar of race and equality in education. He will contribute significantly to Cambridge's research in this area and to addressing the underrepresentation of people from socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds. He immediately became something of a superstar academic, a public intellectual, appearing on UK television and media and receiving numerous honorary doctorates from various universities. Part of his appeal was the story of how he was both a black man and a neurodivergent individual who had overcome adversity and racism to become a leading academic. However, a few months ago, his story started to unravel. The inspirational story he told. When people began to look at everything he had said, parts of the story was a little too unbelievable. Because he had claimed to be a child diagnosed with autism, global development delay as a child, and said that he was non-verbal and could not speak until he was 18 or read or write. That he had deafness and dyslexia. Despite these difficulties, and leaving school with few qualifications, he had progressed through higher education and ultimately obtained a PhD, apparently completing in approximately 2.5 years while working full-time. He said that during this period he was living with a brain tumour and had suffered a stroke shortly after completing his PhD, which has affected his memory about what had happened at that time. He reported having suffered from testicular cancer, suffering epilepsy, and having experienced lockdown syndrome following a car accident. Despite these difficulties, he claimed to have run 30 marathons in 35 days. 9 of these with a fractured tibia. He claimed to have run 300 miles in 3 days and 600 miles in 6 days. He also claimed an amazing humanitarian record on his CV. He said he had raised more than $5 million for charity through his endurance activities, though the exact amount and details changed in different talents. He also claimed to have undertaken humanitarian aid and voluntary work connected with water aid overseas. He claimed professional affiliations with numerous universities and even claimed to have published a book and to have participated in a 7-up documentary series which finished before he was born. 20 years before he was born. He described, however, receiving numerous serious racial abuse during his academic career. Among the incidents attributed to him was an account involving receiving a pig's head. However, subsequent reporting examined whether reports of this account could be corroborated. Most of these claims came under considerable scrutiny in the last few weeks. In many cases, they have been found to either be false or unconfirmed. In 2023, an academic quietly flagged to Cambridge an article that Arde had published, an article which looked uncannily like a work of a different academic that had been published earlier. Okay. That led to a post-publication correction rather than any other action at the time. Then, in 2025, a journalist investigating Arde's PhD thesis for research submitted a formal dossier of evidence to Cambridge and to Liverpool John Moores University, the institution that awarded his doctorate. Arde reported to the journalist to the police for harassment and said he was being hounded for his race. In March 2026, Liverpool John Moores University concluded its investigation into plagiarism claims, finding they amounted to honest and reasonable error caused by poor supervision, and not finding any misconduct. However, in July this year, a former academic who had been kicked out of Cambridge for expressing pretty awful views about race published a blog post showing multiple cases where Arde's work appeared to have been copied and copied other people's work and published it as his own. Days later, the Telegraph published an article documenting more than 100 pages that were nearly in his PhD thesis that were identical or nearly identical to a 209 PhD thesis by a scholar. To 2 days after that, an open letter began circulating which called the Telegraph's article a smear campaign, saying there was no evidence whatsoever of wrongdoing. By the time of Arday's resignation, it had over 17,000 signatures, including the Green Party leader, several Cambridge academics, and Labour MPs. However, within days, several other newspapers published stories calling into question many of Arday's other claims, and Arday himself began to equivocate, describing some of the issues as possible clerical errors. Several signatories quietly withdrew their names, and at that point the media piled on with over 100 articles in the next few weeks. Arday resigned, and a few days later was found dead. The cause of his death has not been determined. An inquest is going on right now. And yet within days, a vigil organised by a campaign group drew an estimated 30,000 people in London alone, with MPs and even the Prime Minister publicly declaring Arday a man effectively killed by a racist media. A verdict reached before the coroner had said a word. Okay. It has since emerged that some academics privately harboured suspicions before the story broke, but they stayed quiet, wary of the political fallout raising the issue would bring. So why am I telling you the story? I want to put to you that our culture has a problem with truth. It has a problem with dealing with evidence. It has a problem with dealing with information. And it also has a problem with how to handle accusations and things that are negative or cast people in a bad light in both directions. We are a culture that races to judgment without waiting for the facts, because judgment fits our agendas faster than truth does. And we have a ruthless cutthroat media and social media ecosystem that makes money, scandal, and outrage whatever direction the scandal pulls. And I think this is an illustration of just how messed up our culture is on this issue. So the passage I'm going to look at this morning is the 9th Commandment, which states, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour." This commandment reminds us that words can hurt people. When I was at school, the teacher used to say, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt you." Rubbish, right? What a person says about others matters. If I tell lies about another person and others believe those lies, that does damage. Okay? In the paradigmatic case, in which the commandment addresses, a person who was a person who lies in a court setting, claiming to have witnessed a crime they didn't witness. Now, this obviously could cause an innocent person to face prosecution, suffer legal penalties, and in some instances it could involve fines, incarceration, or death. Death, however, is the extreme end of the spectrum. But human beings are profoundly social beings. Our standing before our peers and friends is very important to us psychologically. If people perceive they are rejected or hated, this hurts and can affect our mental well-being in many ways. But other people's judgment and assessment of us can also be vitally important in numerous ways. If I'm going for a job, I rely on potential employers' judgment of my abilities, reputation, honesty, and so on to get employment. Trust is an important piece of social glue, and it relies on people having faith in my actions. A person's reputation, therefore, is actually a very valuable asset. Okay? And this is made in the 22nd chapter of the book of Psalms, which says, good up there, "A good name is to be more desired than great wealth. Favour is better than silver and gold." I actually had several years of my life where I was unemployed, and part of that was because I annoyed someone who rang up numerous potential employers and blacklisted them. Actually, doing my life. I criticised an action they were doing in the way they were teaching, and they run various people, and I was told by people in the industry. So, reputation matters. Right? The idea that a person's reputation is something valuable is often overlooked by Christians. And the obvious reason for this is we want to avoid the temptation of peer pressure, and we want to rule this temptation out. So I've often heard Christians say things like, what other people think does not matter. We're called after all to fear God and not man, and so on. The problem is that our reputation is important. It is true that it is not all important, right? And it is true that what God thinks of us is more important. But that doesn't mean that it's not important at all. And this is what this commandment recognises. One's reputation can be destroyed by deception. And just as the 8th commandment warns us against taking other property and ensures that our possessions are secure, this commandment commands us to refrain from harming and guarding other people's good name, and also seeks us to care deeply about the truth. And so I want to look a little bit at what the Bible instructs us in this area this morning, because I've been very troubled by, I think, the way our culture is working in this way, and I think it's really something we as a church need to be very careful about. So let's look at what the Torah commands. On the face of it, the commandment prohibits bearing false witness against your neighbour. The picture is one of a legal setting, whereas a person is accused of crime or serious wrongdoing. But the Torah doesn't just command us not to bear false witness. It also has a whole lot of other commandments designed to sort of spell out how to do this and to protect people from this. So for starters, in the Torah, there is a special criteria for who they appoint as a judge. In Exodus 18, Jethro advises Moses to select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, who hate dishonest gain. Moses later commands tribal leaders to obtain for yourselves men who are wise and discerning. Notice the traits here. They are able and wise. In other words, they're skilled at understanding and applying the moral and legal principles in question, and discerning carefully what the facts actually are. They are people who fear God. Why? Well, they take seriously in their own lives the facts that they're accountable to God and they're subject to His laws. Okay? And tied up with this is that they are men of truth. Right? Truth matters to them. They aim to respect the truth. And finally, they're not people who seek dishonest gain. Why? Because there is a need to avoid certain temptations to depart from the truth for personal reasons such as wealth, reputation, prestige, and so on. And I think this is what we have seen play out at one of the most prestigious universities in the world in the last few weeks. Second, the Torah stressed the need for judges to be impartial, or in biblical terms, people who do not consider the facts. I actually preached a sermon about this whole issue some weeks ago. Consider the first chapter of Deuteronomy. Hear the cases between a fellow countryman and judge righteously between a person and his fellow countryman or the stranger who is with him. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall not hear the small and the great alike. You are not to be afraid of any person, for the judging of his gods. Notice the emphasis here. Judges are to judge on the facts and the law. Do the facts tell us the person did the action in question? Is the action in question actually contrary to God's law? They are not to judge on the basis of whether they are a countryman or a stranger. Now, I've mentioned this before, but the word stranger here is in reference to a foreigner living in Israel. So one is not to judge in favour of your tribal group or against another tribal group simply because they are part of the tribe. By the way, that applies if the tribe is a political tribe. Notice they were not to judge on the basis of whether the person was great or poor. So socioeconomic status should not be taken into account. And in fact, this is repeated several times over in the Torah. In Leviticus 19 it says, you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not show partiality to the poor or give preference to the great. There's two areas here. One is favouring the rich, the powerful, and the person of social prestige. There's obvious reason that people who are powerful, rich, and social prestige can gain favour that is unwarranted. They can use power to twist the system in their favour. And we're all very well of that. We're aware of that. But there's also another obvious temptation, which we don't often hear about. And that is to go the other way and favour the person we think is poor or oppressed. Okay? Because they're poor or oppressed, we just automatically side with them. Okay? And again, I think that might be what's happened recently. If a person from a marginalised group accuses someone of an oppressive act, there are some people in our culture who will immediately jump up and defend the claim prior to any examination of the evidence, and another group of people who will dismiss it prior to any examination of the evidence. Both of these are condemned. The Torah emphasizes this also by condemning bribes. Why? Well, when you accept a bribe, you base your judgment on which option gives you a profit or personal advantage. And this again is allowing these wrong type of factors to influence your judgment. So judges have to be impartial. The law of God expects judges to be people who are concerned about truth. People who fear God, take God's law seriously, and want to actually see it as opposed to their own preferences enforced. They are accountable to Him for the truth and have the moral fibre not to be swayed by things like popularity, tribal affiliation, economics, and so on. To make the decisions on the basis of what favours a person's allegiance as opposed to the facts is commended. And the 19th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy puts in place certain safeguards to protect people from such allegations. So verse 15 states, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Now notice the text here refers to a witness. It doesn't say eyewitness. Okay. Now in rabbinical law, there became a tendency to interpret this passage as requiring 2 eyewitnesses for any crime. And this meant, in fact, the law needed to be enforced. And so in practice, they said, we can't get that ideal, so you have to drop our standards, right? But I want to suggest to you that this misses the point. The word witness here doesn't mean eyewitness. The word witness in the Torah is broader than eyewitness. Okay? In Exodus 22, Exodus 22, the Torah deals with a case where a man has responsibility for caring for another's ox, sheep, or donkey, and dies. Right? The text states, if it is all torn to pieces, have him bring it as evidence. It shall not be condemned to make restitution for what has been torn to pieces. Now the word translated evidence here is actually the word witness. It's the exact same word. Right? Similarly, in Genesis, Laban and Jacob cut a covenant with each other, and Laban says, this heap is a witness between you and me to this day. So notice the word witness doesn't mean eyewitness in the Torah. The idea is that the heap, or the torn animal, provides visible, concrete evidence of the fact. So what I think the law is getting at here is the need for something called corroboration. The idea is this. When there is likely to be substantive harm to another as a result of a claim or an accusation being believed, the accusation needs to be corroborated by 2 or more independent lines of evidence. So, here's an example. Suppose I am seen with a gun on the night of the murder. My fingerprints are on the gun found at the scene, and a bullet matching the gun is found in the victim. Here, there is a witness to me holding the gun, but the accusation is corroborated, right? There's other pieces of evidence that back up and support that are independent, right? Notice also in the Torah, the 2 witness rule is a standard for a charge to be admissible in the court. The judges of Israel were not to entertain an accusation made by someone unless it was corroborated. But once the accusation was admitted, there were further checks in place. The passage continues. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who hold the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who will be in the office in these days. The judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is a false witness and he accuses his brother falsely, then you shall do to him what he intends to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. The rest will hear and be afraid and never again do such a thing. Right? Okay. Now the idea of a fair trial is so common to us today that we don't reflect on the moral teaching implicit in it. So notice what happens here. Where serious accusations are made about another, corroboration is required before they are even entertained. After that, the lines of evidence or witnesses are investigated. The testimony is cross-examined, tested, and so on, to see if it matches the facts. In other words, there is a requirement to check that the sources of evidence are in fact reliable. And notice also that false testimony is treated very seriously. The Torah has much harsher penalties for perjury than our society does. So Madeline deals with legal cases and family law all the time, where parents lie to get a person into jail, and they never prosecute it for it. Right? Because it's just too much of a hassle for the courts, right? Okay? In Deuteronomy, it spells out what's often called the law of retaliation, the idea of the life for a life, eye for an eye. Now, that doesn't mean I can get into a whole circle. It does actually mean literal retaliation in kind. But the point is that the punishment is proportionate to the crime. And notice the implication of this here, right? The punishment the perjurer should receive is the same punishment that would have been dished out had the crime been committed. Okay? The implication is this, is the act of falsely accusing someone of a particular action is as serious as performing that action. Right? A person who falsely accuses another of rape has done something as serious as rape. A person who falsely accuses another of murder has done something as serious as murder. Right? And so on. Now, I understand that in ancient culture, trials didn't function like criminal trials with a jury and a police force. A trial was actually instigated by an accuser. Someone would bring a charge against another before the judges. And the law is saying that such an accusation is a high stakes measure. You have to corroborate your accusation first, even to be heard. Then you have to allow others to cross-examine it and check its reliability. And if it's discovered that your evidence was dubious, whatever penalty you tried to inflict on them will be turned onto you. See the stakes it's making to make the accusation right. People are going to be really reluctant to make the accusation unless they can actually back what they're saying. Right? Now, the idea that we should have this in fair trials and what have you is commonplace, and it should be uncontroversial. I want to suggest to you, however, that in actual fact, even in our culture today, that's not controversial. So how many times have you seen protests or a riot or people demanding a verdict to be overturned that they read about on the news? And so what people are doing, they're saying, I saw something on the news about a trial. I haven't been to the trial, I didn't examine the evidence, but I'm outraged by it. Someone who approaches demands that you deliver a guilty verdict. So they're actually telling people to bypass the judicial process and institute a kind of mob justice on the basis of the protest, if you think about what's going on there. And we see that all the time in our culture. So in actual fact, the idea that you have a fair trial isn't unconstitutional in our culture, but we'll get to that issue, right? But the point here is the scripture doesn't limit this to the legal setting. Okay? Consider what Paul says in 1 Timothy. Okay? The elders who rule well in the church are considered worthy of double honour, especially those who do the hard work of preaching and teaching. So just be in mind. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, labour is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who continue to sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest can be fearful of sinning. So notice, Paul understands the requirement not to entertain an accusation against someone unless there are 2 or 3 witnesses to be applicable to actions of the action of accusing a church leader. He is saying we should refrain from making public judgments condemning church leaders unless whatever accusations we have heard have been corroborated by reliable sources. Isn't that interesting? Now, I've seen many times in New Zealand where the media have reported something that church leader has allegedly said or done, and what happens? Immediately, Christian leaders publicly distance themselves from the Christian leader in question and publicly condemn him. Right? Now, I want to ask the question. Is the media report an accusation corroborated by independent, reliable lines of evidence? No. Is the media report itself a reliable line of evidence? It's an interesting question. And I think, if we're honest, what often happens here is this. Christians are embarrassed at something that has hit the media, and they're trying to avoid certain kinds of narratives of negative publicity that know the media will run. So to save face, they throw the Christian leader onto the ice. controversial, but I think actually that's what's happening in this situation. Okay. Now, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that with our leaders of our own congregation. Right? And bear in mind, something you need to bear in mind here is you don't actually have to have an opinion on what's happening. So some time ago, there was a Supreme Court appointment where the media, where somebody came out and said that the Supreme Court justice that they were trying to appoint had committed a rape, and there was this huge thing in America. And I had lots of people, lots of friends saying, he's guilty, he's innocent. And I just said to them, shut the hell up, you don't know. How would you know what happened 20 years ago at a party? Why do you have to have an opinion? You know, like the honest answer is, I have no idea. You know, we shouldn't do that with our leaders of our own congregations. And in fact, Jesus talks about how to deal with a brother who sins. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take 2 or 3 more with you, so that on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every matter may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to the church, treat him as a Gentile. Tax collector. Notice that Jesus takes the principle from the judicial proceeding of the Torah and applies it to disputes with other believers in the church. Before you accuse a fellow of something, you're required to get their side of the story first. Second, before you make a public accusation, you need to have cooperating evidence. Right? And in fact, the 2-witness rule is found numerous times in the New Testament, where it deals with accusations by individuals against another person. In John chapter 8, when the religious leaders refuse to accept Jesus' testimony about who he is, he responds by notices that 2 witnesses support his claim. Okay? John's epistle talks of 3 witnesses to Christ: the water, the baptism, the crucifixion, and the Spirit. The idea of cooperation is not limited to court cases in the Bible. Okay? It's a principle that's used in general of certain kinds of situations where people make high stakes testimony themselves. In fact, there was one case where it's even suggested it might be the standards you use to judge whether something's profit. So the first thing to note is that God commands not just that believers not bear false testimony, but they be in the habit of not receiving accusation against other believers or people in the church, or even making accusations unless some supporting evidence has been provided. Okay? Now, this is expounded in the Bible with regard to fellow Christians, but I actually believe we should extend the same approach to people who are not believers, even those to whom we disagree. So remember the scriptural teaching of loving your enemies. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Or if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates, you've fallen down under his load. Do not leave it there. Be sure to help with it. I suggest that this claims that if your enemy is being falsely accused, you should speak the truth. If someone is making a claim about a person or group that you strongly oppose, you still have a duty to determine whether it is true. There's something in human psychology known as confirmation bias, and that's a tendency for people to see bits of evidence to support what they already believe and not notice bits of evidence that don't. Okay? And I think we need to be aware that we have that bias. So sometimes we deal with people who are opposed to us as Christians, and we hear something about it that's negative. And I think there's a warning to us there in the Bible about how do we deal with that. And in fact, a few chapters later, after the 10 Commandments, in Exodus 23, it says, "You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in the Spirit, so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to perform justice." Now the word bear here in Hebrew means something like, do not raise a false report or do not spread a false report. The idea is here is of receiving an untrue claim that others have been passing on. And this is seen in the second part. Do not join your hand to be a malicious witness. Think of this. Someone passes on to me a scandalous claim about another person. If I don't pass it on to false flag, I've heard it, but it doesn't go any further. So unless the other person tells someone else, the victim of the accusation will be harmed. Of course, if the person tells someone else, the victim will be harmed, but that will be because of their actions, not because of mine. The point, however, is if I do pass on this information, I ensure and increase the chance that my neighbour will be harmed by it. Hence, I become a party to the slander. I become complicit in it. I therefore have a duty not just to refrain from engaging in slander, but not to repeat it to others. Yeah. And it's interesting here that it says, you shall not follow the masses in doing evil. You shall not testify in dispute so as to turn aside the multitude, right? And verse 2 emphasises not going along with the crowd in wresting judgment. I don't know if you've noticed this, but in our culture today there's a certain kind of popular hysteria about accusations. A claim is made about a person, gets repeated over and over until everyone is outraged, everyone is talking about it, right? And I don't know if you've noticed this in some scandals recently, like when Charlie Kirk was shot, there was a whole lot of people immediately saying he was racist. He said all these things, like all these videos on evidence, and a whole lot of people saying he wasn't this. Immediately, within hours of the shooting, right? And the internet's actually what it's done. The internet has these special things built into it, and if you're conservative, it feeds you conservative stuff. If you're liberal, it feeds you liberal stuff. So when something like that happens, people automatically get all this stuff sent to their feed that confirm what they already believe. And jump on the bandwagon and you get this huge, just massive hysteria. I don't know if you've seen this, right? And this was true before the internet. When I was at Waikato University in the mid-90s, there was a concern about sexual assault occurring on campus. Okay? And as a result, lots of precautionary measures such as lighting, security guards, sexual harassment campaigns were implemented. So much was the concern that there was this kind of danger everywhere. The same year, it became known that a student in one of the halls of residence alleged that another student had sexually assaulted her. The campus went nuts. People began threatening to protest the halls of residence, but didn't immediately expel the student. Lots of people support for the accuser and outrage, and so on. The problem is the claim turned out to be false. When it was later investigated, it was found to have no evidence supporting it. And in fact, the accused was miles away from the accuser at the time that the event happened. In fact, it was in a different city with multiple witnesses seeing them there. Okay. And the accuser herself admitted that she actually made it up. Okay. The police ended up having to deal with a potential problem because they had not investigated properly and not dismissed the evidence when they shouldn't. And so the person was exonerated, but not until after immense repression had been brought to bear on the hall of residence. And an innocent student had been written off as guilty by the student population. I remember that was, this happened at university. It was really quite shocking. Right? And so this is the kind of situation I believe Scripture is warning about. One can easily imagine how it would be people facing a high-profile protest simply to expel a student, or how appealing it is for people outraged about sexual assault to righteously assail the halls of residence, or people who are worried about racism to get on the street and protest something they heard in the media and about these racist people or whatever. The problem is if you were doing this, one would be siding with the masses and doing evil and turning aside the multitude and preventing justice. You need to have the facts first. The point is, people aren't to pass on accusation against others, nor are they to go along with popular outrage of accusations. The Bible explicitly condemns them. So Scripture enjoins us not to give false testimony in support of accusations against others, but to actually check the evidence and corroborate claims before we accuse, and not to entertain accusations without proof. But there's another point about being discreet in general. Leviticus 19 says, you shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. The word NSAB uses the word slanderer, which suggests a person who goes around telling lies about others. But the word translated slanderer in Hebrew actually is talebearer. What this word means can be seen from elsewhere in Scripture, such as Proverbs 11:13. Right? One who goes about as a slanderer or talebearer reveals secrets but one who is trustworthy conceals a thing. Or similar, one who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with gossip. Here, the issue isn't so much the person utters falsehood, but they reveal secrets. Information about another that a trustworthy person worthy keeps private or conceals, but you won't tell anyone about it. And this point often needs noting. Guarding other people's reputation doesn't just mean you refrain from telling harmful falsehoods about them. Even if you know something true, a skeleton in their closet, it doesn't follow you to blurt it out to everybody. Alright? It doesn't follow you to justify blurting it out to the world. It might be necessary to do this because of some kind of public interest or miscarriage of justice or whatever, but a faithful person practices discretion. And this is seen from the passage in Matthew's Gospel, which I mentioned earlier. If a brother sins, go and show him his fault where? In private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. If he does not listen to you, take one or two more, and the testimony of 2 or 3 will be confirmed. Here Jesus explicitly counsels that the dispute be dealt with in private first, with no witnesses. The move to getting a witness and making an accusation is extorted only when the attempts to deal with the matter privately fail, and the person's unrepentant conduct is likely to be a detrimental influence on the community. The point, however, is the issue is something dealt with in private first. We don't need to run around airing everybody's dirty laundry. Even if you know something to someone's discredit, we shouldn't repeat it unless we have to. To do so without a compelling reason is just being malicious. And I know how tempting this can be. I have an online blog where I post about theology and philosophy and ethics. And many years ago I published an article in a philosophy journal. It was one of the first major articles I published in a philosophy journal. And this journal was run by a sort of philosophy association, and put it this way, they're not Christians, put it this way, they're from a group called the Centre for Inquiry, right, which is a free thinking organisation. Right? Now, a very well-known atheist blogger wrote a response and published it in the journal, right? And I put some responses to his article online. In response, he wrote this really nasty, vitriolic post. He ridiculed me, mocked me, cast aspersions on my academic credentials. It was just nasty, right? And then some of his readers came onto my blog and started baiting me, you got to respond to this thing, you know. And this has happened. Someone posted in the comment section on my blog a link, and I clicked on the link, and it went to a site where it concerned a sexual harassment scandal involving this very blogger. The suggestion was that the particular blogger was attending these atheist conferences where prominent atheist speakers were being sleeping with attractive women in the audience after their talks. And he had thought this was going down, and he hit on the woman, and she didn't really want to play, and the whole scandal ended up to right. And I had to make a choice then. Do I let this link stand on my blog? Now, someone else posted it, not me, and generally I have a policy of letting comments stand on my blog. I don't like shutting down criticism. I think that either I respond to it, or if someone says something that's false, I just respond to it publicly. I tend to try not to have a policy of shutting things down. And so it was very tempting for me to say, well, I didn't post it, so I can just leave it there, right? And he'd been really nasty with it. There was a real part of me that he thought, oh, this is really interesting, Now, I'm not trying to preach my own virtue here, because I'm as prone as anyone in the thick of a discussion or a debate to be tempted. But it was a moment when I really had to pause and think, what would God have been doing in this situation? And as a result, I put it down. Blank. And that's why I mentioned who the person was in the sermon. So I want to challenge you this. In a culture where even somewhere like Cambridge University seems unable to confront to a truth, in a world where narratives are pre-written and facts don't matter, we need to do better, right? Truth matters. In a culture that rewards outrage, Christians must be people of truth. In a culture that rewards speed, Christians must be willing to wait for evidence. In a culture that rewards narratives, Christians must be committed to facts. The 9th Commandment calls us not merely to avoid lying, but to become people whose love for the truth reflects the character of God.